What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Today my voice is super deep and I don't know why, but hopefully you can be soothed and also entertained by what we're going to be learning today, which is starting from a very basic sound and learning how to explore from a very simple source. So I have a lot of videos on my channel. I am a neurobase enthusiast. I'm not the neurobase guy, but that's pretty much what my channel is all about. It has it in the title. But I wanted to cover something that goes back to the most important things, which is the fundamental, the source, or making the first steps correct or strong or good choices, rather, because there is no right and wrong. This is a patch that I made, and it sounds like this. A very simple low pass sounding Reese, which really is just a couple of sine waves and actually nothing else. Now, what is significant about this is something that I actually got from somebody by the name of Fanu. If you all are familiar with him and his music, he makes amazing drum and bass stuff, and he's been around since forever. And what is really interesting is that even for somebody of him who has been producing for probably 20, 30 years or so, he's still learning things and doing new things that I think is really inspiring. So the reason why I brought him up was because I learned something from him, which is removing the fundamental whenever you make detuned waves in which to leave space for your sub. So what I mean by that is if I were to play this with just this sine wave, which is actually just the third harmonic, I believe, then you get something like this. Now, even though it has all the cool detuning movement and stuff, and you might be like, well, you're playing a higher pitch, and that's actually not what's happening. I'm playing a low F, but whenever I add in a simple sine wave, we have a really nice and fat sound. The thing that I really appreciate about this, though, is that my sub is consistent, and that's what he was showcasing in this video. But what this alludes to is the idea that you can solve many problems in multiple ways, or solve a problem in multiple ways. So for example, one thing that you could also do with this is to restore that fundamental, say something like this, and then either do something where you high pass this, something like so, or maybe instead of even worrying about that, you set this to an octave here. And you start to manipulate changing the patch in such a way that creates these variations, and that's the entire point. So within this, what I like about it is that you start from a very simple source, which is just a couple of sine waves, and even from just understanding that with these harmonics that we've created, it can drastically change the sound. It opens up so many doors, and on one end can sound kind of daunting because of the choices that you can make, but on the other end, it gives you a framework in which to start somewhere and explore. So with that, something else I think that is important is, let's say we remove this and go back to the original sound. A lot of times whenever you are making these kinds of things, I have masterclasses and stuff on like the complicated basses and whatnot, but understanding the relationship between harmonics and distortion in the first place, for one, you can add something like this, which will make this a lot fatter. We can go here to the first harmonic. And you can start to see that by using this in such a way, you're starting to create a lot of different stuff. You're getting different kinds of waveforms that are not necessarily conventional. They still have a fundamental, or I guess one specific harmonic that makes it what it is, but you can see that by dragging and changing these in such a way that you're going to get massively different results. Now, interestingly, this is actually the exact same thing as adding distortion. It's just that these distortion curves are a particular shape of harmonics that you are adding. Sometimes it could be you're only adding even harmonics or only adding odd harmonics. Sometimes the harmonics that you add are asymmetrical and disproportional. But the fact of the matter is that what you are doing is essentially building something like this from, I guess, a pre-made effect. So if I were to go back into just, something like that and turn on the distortion, where you can hear that it already sounds a little bit more interesting in that way. Which is quite a bit. If I were to back off of this, perhaps. Then you can hear that the sound is starting to become warmer, more fat. If I were to choose different distortion types along with this, maybe I'll even mess with the drive and the dynamics here. Maybe I reduce the spread because I want this to stay in mono. Then you can hear that by manipulating all this stuff, it's becoming much different in that way, and it gives you these different options in which to explore with just a simple amount of tools. And when you're learning sound design, this is one of the most important things, as I've said before, to practice yourself. Even if we don't add distortion, let's say we turn this off and we use maybe an idea of using FM, perhaps we use the same FM source to the phase here. Perhaps we do it the opposite way, where we add in whatever this is to the phase here. That's pretty sick. What happens if we do a combination of all these and we add in just a little bit of overdrive in between? What happens if we detune this a little bit more and then we add in some spread? You start to figure out that there are these relationships that you're building between the interaction of, I guess, the feature sets of your synthesizers, which does kind of bring an importance to like what synth you're using. But at the end of the day, again, there's so many different ways to kind of solve this problem that it doesn't matter, because you can essentially build this same timbre that we have, provided that you know what the harmonic relationship is. But more importantly, it will also teach you to, if you're paying attention and you have a little bit of sound design background, then you can start to notice things that either work or don't work. For example, when we added the spread here, we made the sound wider, but we're actually applying a spread signal to the fundamental, which in turn, I believe, is actually creating stereo within our sub. So if I were to go here to our imager, normally if there's a sine wave, there would be something here that would be relatively consistent. For example, if I were to pull the width down on this and turn stereoize on, then a mono signal would technically look like that. And you might be saying, all right, well, that's where, that's the whole signal and everything is kind of low. But even if you were to grab a multipass or something, which again, I'm kind of showing you different tools that you can use to achieve the same kind of monitoring or so. If I were to just set this to look at everything that is below 80 hertz, even 70 hertz, you can see that this is introducing stereo within your sub. Now, sometimes like having stereo within your sub isn't always necessarily a bad thing, but it's important to understand. It's important to try to notice these nuances of what you're doing, so that way you have more of a sense of control and you can figure out how to learn the structure, and that way you can learn to break the structure. You can figure out things that work or figure out things that don't work, but it helps you recognize problems when things kind of don't go so well. For example, if I were to leave this in here with the spread and maybe I make it a little bit more intense, well, then maybe I can draw back on some of those tools that I used previously, where I am reducing the low end of this group, maybe even by just a small amount. Maybe I'm just taking out everything below 100 hertz. And then I go in and add a sub under it. Well, now it sounds pretty fat. Maybe I don't want it to have the overdrive, so I want to send it directly to the output to where the sub is relatively clean. Maybe it comes to the point to where I want to start to explore and I start changing this from the first harmonic to the second harmonic. Maybe instead of a sine wave, I want to change this into a saw wave. Okay, sounds pretty cool. Maybe we can switch this over to a bandpass instead. So that way we are taking out the low end, but we're also taking out some of the high end. Maybe this sounds really cool, but I want to reduce this just a bit. And maybe I want to add some more distortion to this one in particular. Maybe I want to make this really wide, so I also introduce the spread. And while I'm doing this, you might be like telling yourself of, oh, I like this, oh, I don't like this, but you're missing the point if that's the case. It's more about saying, here's options in which to explore. Here are things that you can do to add a little bit to it. It's like when you're making a new kind of dish or whatever, you add a little bit of salt to it, you add a little bit of pepper to it, taste it. How does it taste? Still needs something. That's how you can start to figure out what it is that you are missing within your sound design, at least like up to a certain point. The more that you develop your relationship with more effects, the more that you can start to figure out how to go into solving those more complex problems. For example, a lot of times with neurobase, people are like, well, how do I use neurobase in context? Well, a lot of times it's because you don't actually have a good fundamental, or your sub sucks. I was just talking to my buddy about this, and you start realizing, all right, well, let's say I've got this crazy filter or whatever that I'm doing. I'll just pull up something random, and it can just be, I don't know, the aberration filter, and we turn this on and we're like, all right, what does this sound like? Now, when I'm listening to this, for this patch in particular, it might be something to where I'm like, you know what, this sounds really cool, but I don't really like how it sounds like there's that smudge over here. So I'm listening for it. Let's see if we can make it happen again, because it's kind of randomized. Yeah, in certain cases it sounds pretty cool, but my intuition tells me that there's most likely something happening between our low mids, either on this band or this band. And now look how much cleaner that sounds. Now, had I not known to put a notch there, you know what I mean? There's some fiddling and some trial and error to kind of work with, but these are things that you start to pay attention to because you've noticed that you've, I guess, like developed a vocabulary of effects. And this is kind of like the trail of sound design and about how you learn how one thing leads to another. Likewise, though, there's a lot of other different ways to solve this problem. For example, instead of just doing something like that, I could actually do some kind of gain reduction if I wanted to, or just turning down the low mid section. Perhaps I want to introduce some kind of stereo into the low mid section, which can also sometimes be solved by introducing like a phaser or a flanger. So in turn, what ended up happening with that was I created a new timbre with it. It didn't quite solve the problem, but I discovered something new. And this, hopefully you guys are getting the point about this, but with this, I was able to kind of figure out, a new step. I was like, oh, well, if I have a good kind of fat, mid bass or something, and I apply a phaser to the low mid band, I've learned something now, and maybe I can use that later in the future. Maybe I can start a new bass, or just kind of go and use this off of a jump off point and then start to process this. Maybe after that, I add in my notch filter of the sort. So I just kind of swept the frequencies here, and I realized that that also sounds kind of cool, so I can kind of use this to make this move around. And I don't have to worry about losing my sub because these frequency bands are kind of splitting that up. So while I'm not trying to teach you about neurobase in particular, it's more so about how to go from taking something very simple and finding possibilities in between in which to find your own sound. Another way that you could do this is by pulling up patches or presets and stuff, maybe that aren't too complicated. And for one, reverse engineering them. So the way that you would do that is, let's say you have this patch. Well, you start turning everything off one by one. So you turn off that, you turn off that, you turn this off, and you go all the way from, even if you don't know what this stuff is, you turn this off. You're like, I'm not getting any sound. Why? And you start going back and being like, oh, okay, so this turns this on. All right, well, what does this do? Oh, okay, well, that's what that does. All right, what does this do? Well, it doesn't, I can't really tell the difference, so maybe I'm going to move this over. Okay, what happens if I change the shape? All right, what happens if I do this? Oh, okay, well, this sounds cool. Maybe I don't even need this. And you're like, oh, wait, why do I? So you start to see that there are these visual hints that help you figure out how things are connected, and phase plan is one of the best ways to realize that, because if you pull something up, you can see that this is being sent to this. There's this routing chain that's visible, and then when you pull off of it, it disappears, and it's genius. Kilohearts, good job. That being said, this is how you learn sound design. This is how you learn how to take something simple and make it more complex, because it's not really complex. It's just multiple simple things put together. When you understand the simple things on an individual basis, and you start to find those relationships, that is where you get into becoming like advanced at sound design, or advanced at trying to get the stuff that you hear in your head in some cases, which I never think is like really like totally possible unless if you've already made the sound before. But it does give you a sense of direction. And if you allow the direction to inspire you, but then be open to possibilities, that is where you will find a happy place within your sound design. So thank you for this. I appreciate the watch if you sat through the entire thing. If you are interested in making more complex basses, I have masterclasses on my ARCANUM memberships. If you like these kinds of sounds in general, I have tons of presets available for phase plant, for vital, for other things on my website at alckemy.com. And if you just want to show some support, but you don't really want to invest, then you could just like the video. That helps me a lot. Share this if you find this useful, and help me grow my channel if you'd be so inclined, or leave a comment and tell me why you didn't like it. Whatever. Much love, guys. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.